So if you've ever noticed when you're wringing out cloth, you got the cloth and you got water coming out of it, and as the water comes out, it looks very different. And the reason behind that is because when the water is underneath the surface, like in this scenario, the light comes in and it bounces off all around, just bounces like crazy around this very bumpy kind of surface. And then as the water comes out of it, there's a smooth coating all around it that makes it so that the light bounces off uniformly. And you can represent that here with displacement. Displacement is just where you plug in the texture. It makes it look like it's got a different kind of bumpiness to it. So what's happening here is there's a bit of math and whatnot that just makes it so that this area is black and this area is white. Black is equal to 0, white is equal to 1. And you multiply that by a height map, which in this case is just this, where the dark spots are lower and the white spots are higher. And so whichever parts of this equal 0, there will be 0 deviation in the surface, and it will be a completely smooth surface, such as when water is leaving it, you get this clear shine. And then wherever it's white, that means that it's going to be multiplying 1 by whatever the texture is, so it's going to be a lighter and therefore higher value, and then you're going to have a bumpy reflection over here. And you want to be easy on the displacement. You got to run it through a displacement node, through the height thing. I don't know what mid-level does. I don't mess with it, but the scale should be very small. Over here, I can show you that I have a value that is being multiplied by a very small amount being plugged into the scale displacement, and even then, when I scroll a little bit, it starts looking really janky. So you want to be very easy on that. I keep it around 0.01 for the most part. I think that looks pretty good. So anyway, the idea here is that if you want to represent water leaving the cloth and making a perfectly smooth surface, then you can do that by having a texture that is black where you want it to be smooth and white where you want it to be bumpy. And it doesn't have to be through dot products. You don't have to pay attention to any of this map, because over here I can just use the texture where I painted some parts black, some parts white. And ultimately when you plug that in, you can get the same effect, and that is more useful for being able to animate this. You might be able to have some sort of animated video file being plugged in to the texture and get a similar effect that way. Now, technically, it's not a perfect representation of the material, because what we're doing is, instead of having the volume of the water go out and make the surface smooth, we're just saying we're going to multiply 0 by the existing displacement, and these bumpy values are going to shrink. So the smooth parts are going to be smaller than the bumpy parts, when that's not technically how that works. But it doesn't really matter as long as you do bump only. If you do displacement and bump, and you have a high value, then you can see how the bumpy parts are bigger than the smooth parts, which isn't necessarily physically accurate, but that doesn't really matter so much, I don't think, at all, because if you're going to represent it with a texture at all, textures look good when they are very small values anyway, where you're pretty much not going to notice. So you might consider doing something where you do some crazy extra stuff to have it displaced properly and look a lot better. But I think the simplest approach is just to have a height map like this, where the dark parts are low and the white parts are high. Multiply that by some mask, where you can deliberately paint on which parts should be dark, meaning which parts should be smooth and which parts should be light, meaning which parts should be bumpy, and just run it that way. So that's all I got mostly, except one more cool thing I figured I'd throw in is that if you're doing all this math anyway, you can also run whatever thing. You can run the thing that's determining how displaced each part is going to be through a color ramp, like this, just basically a gradient, and plug that into the color so that the high parts are a different color than the lower parts. If you want to do that, that might be applicable to certain scenarios, certain liquids. I don't know. It just kind of looks cool. That's all I got.